You're listening to Mentionables Sunday Night Live.
I am here, solo, talking about the 1-year anniversary of the Mentionables, which is today. We are celebrating our 1-year anniversary today. So I'm hoping that I can get some participation from you guys. But I'm going to review some stuff and talk about what it's like mentioning for 1 year. So this is the post that started it all right here. This is the post I posted on a whim about a daydream that I'd been having for some time. Let me zoom in on this. It was a daydream that I had had for a while. I wanted to start a conference. It's something I thought about seriously doing. But I also knew that conferences required money and a venue, and I didn't have those kinds of things. But over the years of doing apologetics, I had gotten to the point where I had got to know and be friends with a number of talented people online who were essentially the same as me. They were doing apologetics as kind of a side gig, and they still had to support themselves and their families with a real job, but nevertheless, they were good at what they did, and they had a good voice and good ideas. I thought, wouldn't it be cool to get all of those guys together? So I know this goes out as a podcast, so I'm going to read the post up here from August 5th of 2017. It says, so I have this fantasy of starting a nationwide apologetics tour and conference featuring all of the talented and devoted apologists that I know who don't receive as much attention as I feel they deserve. I'm looking at you, Tyler Vella, Chad Gross, Nick Peters, and others. You know who you are. I would call it the Mentionables. Yes, I would be a speaker as well. Now, why the name the Mentionables had popped into my head at some point, I couldn't really say. I suppose it's just because these guys were so under the radar, but they were so cool and good at what they did. I figured these guys are mentionable. We're not going to get the big guy in here. We're going to get these little guys and call them the Mentionables. So then I'm reading some responses I got to that post. This is from Chad Gross. He says, wow, Joel, I'm honored to be mentioned. I don't know if he did that intentionally or not, but anyway, he says, I'm honored to be mentioned. Thank you. And that would be great. Emphasis on great. And I responded to him. I said, don't thank me yet. Right now, this is just a pipe dream. For a while now, my wife and I have been like, we should host an apologetics conference. Then cruel reality strikes. We don't have those kinds of resources. My home church seats about 150 people. It's not a great venue for a conference. I'm going to pause the narrative there and say, that's true. The church at which I attended at the time had a pretty small stage, didn't have any like back rooms or odd rooms to do breakout sessions. It was a nice church, but it wasn't like the type of place to hold a conference, at least compared to conferences that I'd been to. Anyway, I continue the narrative. But who's going to pay for travel and lodging for the speakers? But in my head, I'm thinking, there's a lot of talent out there that haven't seen exposure they deserve. Instead of Alan Schleeman, what if I got Chad Gross? And Tyler responded with, so is this a dream or should I get my hopes up? So Tyler clearly wanted to jump wholeheartedly into this thing. I'm sure he'd been eager to do something like this like I had. And so here comes a guy that's mentioning him and in a post about doing an apologetics conference with these little guys. So he had his hopes up, and I don't blame him. Here's Nick Peters' response. He said, I'd be totally down for this, but I'm wondering who this Tyler Vella person is. Sounds like some sort of loser. Now, I'll give the context for this, that of the people I tagged, Nick Peters and Tyler Vella were pretty much the only two that had actually known each other and interacted online. And the two had developed a sort of friendly rivalry online, and they poked fun at each other. Nick Peters especially enjoyed the rivalry. And so Tyler Vella responds to Nick Peters' post. He says, he really is, referring to himself. Joel Furches is scraping the bottom of the barrel with that guy. Plus, I hear he rejects Molinism. What kind of modern apologist doesn't fawn over the work of WLC? That's William Lane Craig he's talking about. And I responded to him saying, hey, the Mentionables are supposed to be the alternative to the big names like WLC. Have you already forgotten what we stand for? Keeping in mind that this is like the third post in response. Then this is another response I made. I say here, look, buddy, if I had like money and resources, I swear to you I would be contacting you to recruit you for this. Given that this is an apologetics conference, your speaking slot would probably be titled, Arguing with Online Atheists, Stupid Things They Say, Smart Things You Should Say. This is my response to Tyler, specifically because if you listen to Tyler's podcast, occasionally he'll do an entire podcast talking about an argument he had with particular atheists online, and he'll recount the argument and then give the reasons that he was right and they were wrong. So this was kind of a trend with him, and I was poking fun at him for this. Hey, John. Nice to have you on. I think you're my only watcher right now. I continue. All right, so this is my response. Oh, yeah, okay. So Adam Coleman jumps in, and he tags another guy that he works with, who is the director of the Free Thinking Ministries. Name is escaping me right now, but I'll remember it after the podcast is off. And so Adam had come on and tagged him. Well, Adam was actually in my mind when I was tagging people in the original post, but I hadn't tagged Adam because Adam does a very different kind of apologetics than the rest of us. And I didn't know if he would, I didn't even know if he was interested in your more garden variety apologetics, given that he's an urban apologist. And what he does is very different, typically. Now, Adam is a very versatile guy, so I'm not going to put him down by saying he can't do garden variety apologists. He can, and he's better than most people I know. So he tagged him, and I responded to him because I was a little embarrassed that I hadn't tagged him, considering he jumped into the conversation. I said, I was thinking of you too, Adam, but then I thought, is this something he would even be interested in? And Adam responds by saying, heck yeah, I'd be interested. Count me in. So at that point, Adam was part of the team. He said, count me in. I included him in everything, and he's been a valuable addition. All right. Then Tyler says, okay, but really, how do we do this? I have never done any fundraising or conference planning. I know some who have, though if we were serious about this, ... So yeah, I'd known people who'd done conference planning as well, but at this time in my mind, we're talking about a tour bus around the country, and that was not a single conference. But Tyler was devoted to the idea of a single conference, and that's what we ended up doing. So the next one, this is me speaking. I said, okay, y'all, since we all have the same vision, I say we pool our resources and make this happen. I've got $10 I can throw into the pot. So clearly here I'm joking, but I'm also testing the waters to see if these guys are actually interested and try to bring resources together. Tyler responds to me by saying, I have 2 kids and student loans, so I have negative $1,000. Does that help? I respond, well, for what it's worth, I was joking about having $10. The point is, yeah, John, a tour bus would be great. It's not something I've counted out of my head, but it's going to be a long time till we have those kinds of resources, unless we get an anonymous donor that just piles the money on. All right, so here I say, do you know how tempted I am now to start a private group labeled the Mentionables and just invite you guys? Now, this is a response because I'm just reading a couple of select comments on the original post, but the post was getting up to over 100 comments now as all the different guys were talking between themselves and to me and so forth. It was becoming a very long thread. And this is something we're all very excited about. So I figured, hey, let's start a group. We can chit-chat about this, carry this conversation on, throw ideas around and just have fun with this daydream of mine instead of extending it all to a single thread of conversation. So this was me, and thanks, John. I didn't know you were so wealthy, and I don't know, where are you getting these funds from? All right. Anyway, so I went over to start the group. Now, I'd started groups before. I started at least 2 groups on Facebook that I am the moderator for. So, I mean, it's not a process I hadn't been through before, but for some reason, I tripped up and I went through the process, and instead of building a group, I built a page, a Facebook page. Now, I didn't realize that I built something that was different than a group until it was completely done, and it was different than a group page. And it took me a while to figure out what I had done, but I'd created not a group page, but a web page, a Facebook page for an organization that didn't exist. It was a joke we were still throwing around. But there I had it. I'd created a front for an organization that didn't exist. All right, now, recently, as we were getting set to celebrate our 1-year anniversary today, I had asked members of the network. Well, let me explain the network very quickly. So we had the original team, which was the original 5 guys that got into this conversation. And but over time, we had other people who started jumping on board and being interested in it. And once we got up to 6 people, I really didn't see us being able to sustain a conference speaking group more than 6 people. 6 people already seemed a little bloated to me. Most conferences that I've been to have had maybe 2 big speakers and then a couple of breakout sessions. Typically like 4 total. Yeah, the whole thing was fortuitous accident, John. It gets better from here. So anyway, getting back to what I was saying. So we had 6 people. I didn't want to bring any more on board, but we had a lot of really talented people that were expressing interest. And so I was ripping out my hair trying to figure out what to do about this. And that's when the idea of a network came into my mind. I was like, what if we got these guys, we created a catalog entry for them where we listed all of their talents and all the things they bring to the table. So for instance, video editing, sound editing, various arguments they're really good at. Somebody who's like studied down with the cosmological argument, or somebody who's like a hardcore theologian, these are resources they could offer to an entire network of people, of small-time apologists that need support sometimes. And then they could also list the needs they had. So maybe they needed somebody to help them set up a podcast. Maybe they needed somebody to come on to their blog and write guest articles. Who knows? But they could express their needs, express their talents, and the things they could do. And then as we gained network members, we could match the needs to the talents and get these guys together to do things. So that happened. Our network is, I think we're at about 15 people in the network right now. So this is when I was getting ready to celebrate our 1-year anniversary. I asked the network if any of them wanted to, and the team, if anyone wanted to give testimonials or things that had been meaningful to them as being part of the team in the network. Now, I only got one response, and that was from this gentleman, Randy. So for the podcast listeners, I'll read this. He says, "I love what you guys are doing. You guys, presumably the team, because he's part of the network now too." And he says, "There's a lot of us out there who are passionate about not only their faith, but about their particular ministries and apologetics. And now, because of the Mentionables, we have a network available that allows us opportunities that we didn't have before. God bless you all." Well, thanks, Randy. I really appreciate that. Hopefully this continues to grow and we can do something to help one another. We can actually build a structure of support that advances apologetics as a field. Because apologetics, it started out as sort of this side curiosity in theology, and now it's a driving force that's really advancing the cause of Christ in the nation, I feel. All right, so this is Chad Gross. I'm going to talk about the different members. Chad Gross was one of the 4 people I originally tagged. Well, technically 3, because Adam came on and I hadn't tagged him, much to my embarrassment. But we continue. Chad Gross is a gentleman I met early on in my apologetics ministry. I was looking for local apologists to interview because I was a journalist at the time. I was a Christian journalist for local news, and I was looking for somebody who was local to my area that I could interview and then write an article about. And the only one I could find was Chad here from his ministry, Truth Bomb Apologetics, which is a funny name, but he stands by it. Chad is a really upstanding guy, and he's very encouraging to others. The majority of Chad's ministry involves promoting materials and solid resources from others. That doesn't mean that Chad is a bad apologist. Chad is really good at what he does, and what Chad typically does is to do the research, to look into the information that's out there, and to draw it all together and present it in a way that can be understood well. So Chad actually has networked with a lot of the big names, and nobody's heard of Chad Gross, but a lot of the big names out there have heard of Chad Gross. So that's the important thing, and he continues that. Recently, he's shifted to more of a family focus for the apologetics that he does. So this is one of the later banners that I created for the Mentionables. I kind of went nuts on the graphics and the banners for the Mentionables. At one point, they actually hosted a intervention for me because I kept switching up the banner images and the logos and so forth that I was designing. So this is one of the later ones. Okay, yeah, this is responding to a comment that a listener is doing. He says, didn't he do some work on an apologetics themed Bible? Referring to Chad. Yeah, Chad wrote an entry for the Apologetics Study Bible for students. And the Bible was, the study Bible was created, and most of it was written by Sean McDowell, who is the son of Josh McDowell, and he's the heir apparent to Josh McDowell and his ministry. So Sean McDowell's a pretty big name, and it's one of the people that Chad is connected to very closely, in fact. At any rate, so this is one of the Mentionables banners that I designed later on. This is probably an even later banner. At this point, I'm just playing. This is not a great one. You can hardly see the motto, which says "Men on a Mission." The mottos are the other things that I should talk about, because I went a little crazy with the mottos. We ended up with like 3 or 4 of them, but we'll continue. All right, talking about the members, the people I tagged. This is Tyler. Tyler, I originally ran into on my networks. I'd seen some stuff he posted and that he was involved in a podcast. And I love podcasts, so I tuned into his podcast. And the thing that really impressed me, like the first thing I think I ever saw or listened to him on the podcast was talking about the arguments about slavery in the Old Testament. And he did an excellent job of defending that. It's not as if I hadn't seen that argument and responses to it before. I read Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster, which spends a lot of time talking about that. But Tyler's was as good, if not better, than Copan's response. So I really appreciated that about him. And I kept tuning in. Eventually, I was still a journalist at the time, so eventually I contacted him, got an interview. I reviewed his podcast. I interviewed him, and I reviewed his book. He contacted me when he wrote and published his book, and so I did that. So Tyler seemed like an obvious choice when I was thinking about bringing a speaker out, because I appreciated his work. Tyler was more heavily theological in his work, and he tended to engage philosophically with a lot of these atheists and the atheist arguments. I talked about earlier how Tyler spent a lot of time talking about arguments he'd gotten into. Tyler was not shy about engaging directly with it. And so he was an obvious choice, one of the reasons that I tagged him. When I tagged him, I didn't know about the feud between him and Nick, who I also tagged. But that's been fun to have them both on the team and poking at each other the whole time. This is Adam. We already talked about Adam. Adam, I met when, let's see, how much of the backstory do I need to give you? At one point, I ran a very highly visible article series during the month of February. I was trying to run an article a day, and February was a good month to do that because it has the least days of any month. Now, I did this on a leap year, so I ended up having to do 29 instead of 28 articles, but even so, it was less work than it would have been on any other month. So I got a lot of feedback on that series, and a lot of it was positive from Christians and very negative from atheists. But one of the feedback I think I got from another Christian was that February is Black History Month, and I should have done a series on Black history. Well, it's not as if the idea hadn't come across my mind before. One of the most highly visible and popular article series I ever did was during Women's History Month, when I did articles about exposing some women apologists to give them some exposure and talk about the work they did. And it was very popular to get those names out there and give them a little exposure. I had thought about doing the same thing for apologists that were African American, because you don't see a lot of those. They're still kind of very under the radar. So giving them exposure was something I had thought about doing, but it's ground that needs to be tread lightly. So it's something that I'd been a little shy about. But then when a reader came back at me and said that that's something they'd like to see, I launched into it. I contacted a number of very talented apologists, and a lot of them said that they'd like to participate. But in the end, Adam was the only one that did participate. So he did, and we got to know each other just in corresponding. And the work that he did was quality work. So that's one of the reasons I thought about tagging him. But then again, given the fact that he did urban apologetics instead of the garden variety, I wasn't sure if this was something he was even interested in. Turns out he was, and it was great having him on the team. He was, when we had our conference, he was very involved in responding, and his presentation when he was up on stage was tremendous. If you haven't seen it, it's available as a video, and we have it in our podcast as well. So do yourself a favor and check it out. Adam, great guy, and a very valuable member of the team. All right, so designing the logo. This was the second logo that I designed. We'll see the first logo in a while, but I'll talk about it right now. Here I am. I'm creating a Facebook page, and I need a logo to go with it. And I'm thinking, well, what do you do for an Christian apologetics logo? I mean, do I just like give it a cross or a dove or any of the traditional Christian symbolism? And it was a tough decision because honestly, I'm not a big fan of the traditional Christian symbolism. And, I hesitate to even portray Jesus or God or any form like that because it just doesn't seem appropriate. So what do? Well, we were the Mentionables. And it occurred to me that I could do sort of an icon that involved mentioning. So I had two faces opposing one another, talking to one another. And then I formed that into an M for Mentionables. I really like the symbol. Now, I did this one, which is black and red. The original was white and red. But the black and red was for the podcast. When Neil Hess, who I'll talk about in a bit here, set up the podcast, he asked if I could provide graphics for it. So I just redid our emblem and made it a little different for the podcast. And this one is, it seems like it's probably the most popular of the two, but I'm split on which one's better. I think I still lean towards the original. So it was, let's see, this would have been October, and we started in August. So it was like 3 months after we really formed the team. And this is Chad and I. There was a local apologetics conference that the two of us always attended. It was just kind of a thing. But this time, and I'd had a book table at the conference before because I'm an author. I wrote a book that was apologetic in nature, and I'd sold it at this conference before. Well, this time, I wanted to set up a book table and represent the Mentionables. Sorry, John, I'm catching up on your comments. Yeah, Adam was an excellent presentator. I don't know if that's a word, but he did it. So at any rate, so Chad and I always went to this conference and kind of met up and hung out and so forth. But this time we got a table, for the Mentionables. Now, there are a total of 3 authors in the Mentionables. Chad is one of them. So we had a book with the 3 books that represent the Mentionables team, and then we got some flyers and brochures. Okay, so I'd like to talk about Nick Peters. This shadowy, mysterious figure here is Nick Peters, one of the guys that I tagged. Nick Peters is very intelligent, and he makes an excellent defense, especially for the resurrection. That's his area of expertise. Partially the fact that he's got direct connections with the godfather of apologetics. Let's see, he's the son-in-law for Mike Licona, and he's also good friends with Gary Habermas, who introduced him to his wife. So he's got the pedigree there, and he's also got an education in something, I think theology. But at any rate, this is the ongoing joke with him. I do affirm the virgin birth. So why is anybody who follows him or the Mentionables or whatever has heard this ad infinitum? What's the deal with the virgin birth? So here's this backstory for that, for all of you who are wondering. Yeah, name drop. Well, he does that all the time. You can't talk to him without hearing those names dropped. And so anyway, here's Nick. I do affirm the virgin birth. Here's the backstory for that. Nick got into a conversation or argument or something where somebody pointed out to him that you have the story of the virgin birth in 2 Gospels, and they're later Gospels. So it's not mentioned in Mark, which is the earlier Gospel. It's not mentioned in any of the writings of Paul, which are the earliest Christian writings that we have. So, it seems like a late development. How do we know that that's even original doctrine? This is an idea of like shooting down the different doctrines one by one by saying, hey, this is the virgin birth. You don't hear about it until later. And so Nick responds that, you have Paul, who's instructing the early church and talking to churches he's already planted and preached to. He would probably have gone ahead and assumed that they knew about the virgin birth. It was not a topic that you needed to bring up in every single thing you wrote and constantly talk about, and so it didn't get talked about in his writings because that wasn't the point of his writings. And, in the Gospels that came out earlier, this is an oral tradition. So the fact that they didn't name drop the virgin birth constantly doesn't necessarily mean that this wasn't a doctrine that was known about. And so he decided to that he was going to make that point in argument to the ridiculous, whatever the name for that is, where every other sentence out of his mouth is talking about the virgin birth, to show how ridiculous it would be to have somebody constantly talk about the virgin birth as if that's what needed to be done, so that everybody constantly knew, oh, he does talk about the virgin birth. He does affirm the virgin birth. So that's that joke. It's just a point, and on an argument that's still going on in his head, I suppose, that he's making the point that it would be ridiculous to constantly talk about affirming the virgin birth. So this is Neil Hess. Here's the story behind Neil. I first became aware of Neil back when I was a journalist, because I followed the work of J. Warner Wallace, who at the time was still a police detective. And yes, you're right, John. Argument ad absurdum. There you go. Thanks for digging that up for me. At any rate, Neil Hess wrote in on the podcast that I listened to from J. Warner Wallace and talked about how he was a teacher and he really wanted to start an apologetic ministry that was, actually he wrote on the Facebook page, it wasn't to the podcast, but at any rate, he wanted to start an apologetic ministry which was accessible to students like the ones that he taught. Fairly sure he does middle school. At any rate, having heard that or read it on the Facebook page, I contacted him directly because I interviewed small-time startup apologists. That's what I did as part of the work that I did. So I did an interview with him, and I got his conversion story and his hopes and dreams for this ministry he started up. So we were friends, and I had followed him ever since. Now, after the Mentionables stopped being a joke, it became a real thing. Two of the people that I had tagged kind of dropped off the map, and they weren't really getting involved in anything we'd done. So I assumed that they, after it became sort of a real thing, that reality had hit them, that it just wasn't something that was feasible, and they moved on concentrating on their ministries, which I can't blame them. I mean, that's the thing. But I wanted four guys. If it was just me, Nick, and Tyler, that was a little small of a team, so I wanted to get a fourth guy in there. And so I contacted Neil because, he's still got a very impressive website. He offers a lot of resources. He's a voice guy, so he's got the sound aspect down. He's a video guy, so he's got the video. So he's technical. He's a good apologist. He's a very valuable person, and I contacted him, and he said yes. So he was a late addition, but he still remains a member of the core team. And if you listen to Sunday Night Live, then you've heard his voice because he's the host of Sunday Night Live, except when he isn't. All right, so here's the original Mentionables logo. I've kind of already talked about that. You can make up your mind as to whether you like the black one or the white one better. I think I probably like the white one better, but don't hold me to that. All right, so I was talking about how I went nuts in the banner images. This was another one, but there's a story behind this one. I was digging around for things that the Mentionables could do legitimately. I didn't expect to get to a conference, a point where we were doing conferences. So I'm figuring, well, we can do the podcast, which we did. We'd already had that set up. Maybe we could do a writing project. And what if we were to offer a rescue to people who are getting stuck in arguments with atheists online? We can swoop in, lend our expertise, and save these poor souls who are getting battered by the atheists. They could light up the Mentionable signal, and we would be there. So I created this graphic with the Mentionable signal. That didn't go anywhere, the idea of the Mentionables jumping in and saving people, because Neil Hess rightly pointed out that it was just a waste of time to engage with internet trolls. So that's true. And then this is one of the many mottos that I came up with, many voices, one message. That was really inspired by Nick Peters, because when I was interviewing him about his hopes and dreams for the Mentionables, he said something that we would be not united as one, and so that was a good idea. So I came up with the motto: "Many voices, one message," which seems appropriate. Yeah, I like the white one better too, John. Nice to see we're on the same page for once. Okay, this is super small. I was going to talk about the network at this point, but I already kind of have, so we'll skip past this super small graphic. The Troll Patrol. Okay, so this is the thing I was just talking about, jumping in and rescuing people online from conversations with internet trolls. And so the Troll Patrol was something I came up with when I was coming up with teams that network members could join. So the Troll Patrol was a team. It was an idea I still had in the back of my head. I mean, if somebody wanted to, legitimately come in and help people who are stuck in arguments with atheists online, then we could have a reserve team who was willing to do that. And the Troll Patrol has actually been a team that most network members have been interested in jumping in on. So apparently there's a market out there. All right, that looks like the end of my graphics. Not too many questions coming in from online, so I'll wrap this presentation up with a very, sentimental video that I made after our conference, after we all came into the room and worked so cohesively as a team. And it was sad to leave because it was such an incredible experience to come together in a room and immediately be best friends and a team together. So here we go.
You and me make a perfect team. Hey, you and me, we make a perfect team. Let's travel the world and the seven seas. 'Cause you and me, we make a perfect team.
So John asks, where do we go from here? John, I'm in the process of talking with one of our network members about doing a second conference, and we'll see. Yeah, we'll see what happens with that. It sounds like it's going to happen. So the question is, the location we did the first conference was really an ideal location because Chad and myself and Adam and Nick all live on the East Coast, and it was kind of equidistant from all of us, so it was relatively easy travel. We managed to all get there by car, and then the church provided us lodging. So expense-wise, it was really good. The only person who really had to dish out and put it in some expense for air travel was Tyler, and thank God he was able to do that. But the next location we're looking at is Texas, which is a long ways from every one of us. So seeing if we each individually have the funds to get out to that one's going to be a challenge. We'll see. I'm just reading the comments from Facebook. The Mentionables say, great time at the conference. I agree, it was a good time. And Caleb says, Caleb is one of our network members. He says, yeah, I was thinking the same. What does the next 5 years look like for the Mentionables? Wow, what does the next 5 years look like for the Mentionables? I mean, in 1 year, we've managed to create a podcast, which we're polishing up. We're in the process of doing Mentionables TV, which is a weekly broadcast on YouTube. And we'll see if that keeps up. Who knows? We've published a book together, and we've got ideas for another book. So things continue to snowball, and opportunities continue to present themselves. So it's getting better and better. I am not so enamored as to think that the bottom might not fall out of this thing eventually. But if it were to fall out, that doesn't undo the work that the Mentionables have done. We've touched lives. We've helped people. We know that people are engaging with us because, I mean, look at the question of the week that we do. The question of the week has touched people, and we get good feedback on that. So progress has been made towards the kingdom of God. And whether or not the Mentionables stay together, eventually, we may disband and all go our different directions, which will be sad, but it could happen. Nevertheless, we've had an impact in the time that we have. Praise be to God, because, here we are, a ragtag band of misfits, but we've managed to do something in the time that we've been together. And, as Scripture tells us, God is made strong through weakness. And, you get a bunch of small-time guys together, small-time voices. That's some weakness right there, but God has worked through that, not to overly compliment ourselves. So who knows where we're going to go? I hope we continue to go. I think we've all got some stuff left in us. And as long as we continue to give the glory to God. That's one of the things. My wife is not happy about the name The Mentionables because it puts a lot of emphasis on us. Which seems like a bad thing for a ministry. It's too late to change the name. It's stuck, but I think we can spin it in such a way that's more to God's glory than to our own. All right, John is asking for the video to be played a second time. Absolutely. Most of these photos that you're seeing were actually shot by John, so he's looking at his own handiwork as we play this video. All right, we don't need to see it ad infinitum. All right, I have finished my presentation. I'm ready to sign off. We can continue the conversation on the video, and for our podcast listeners, keep on mentioning. Goodbye.